Well, imagine a world where death doesn't get the final word. Imagine a world where injustice, violence, and tyranny no longer carry ultimate power. Imagine a world where even the very worst things like betrayal, oppression, and unfair execution, have been transformed into things that bring life. Because that is the astonishing claim at the heart of Christianity. The resurrection of Jesus Christ isn't just the happy ending to an otherwise tragic story, it is the beginning of a new reality. The resurrection is the beginning of God's new world. And just part of what the resurrection changes is our attitude as Jesus' followers towards justice. And that's because if Jesus Christ is risen from the dead, then justice, healing, and restoration are affirmed, not just as central to the agenda of the God who raised Jesus, but to the agenda of the church that follows Jesus. And this is for a whole number of reasons, some of which I want to cover this morning, beginning with this. The resurrection is God's emphatic yes to Jesus' way. The very first thing that the resurrection of Jesus declared that it proclaimed was that God had vindicated the life and the teaching of Jesus. In other words, he had shown it to be right. Jesus spent his ministry, as most of us know, doing things like welcoming the excluded, feeding the hungry, challenging wealth and power, and showing mercy constantly to those on the margins. And Jesus announced that agenda in the synagogue at Nazareth in Luke chapter 4. And he spoke about bringing in his person to fulfillment those words that were read to us earlier by David from Isaiah 61. So Jesus speaks these words in the synagogue at Nazareth, a virtually verbatim quote from Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He's sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year or the era of the Lord's favour. Jesus' ministry was revolutionary because it was such a challenge to the status quo, but crucially, it was all done through the power of loving service. It wasn't imposed in some sort of oppressive way. Sometimes people seeking justice can seek to rather impose it upon society. Jesus does it through the power of loving service. And a world that had never seen anything like this simply couldn't recognize it. It simply couldn't recognize that Jesus was bringing God's healing, restoring rule to the world, and it responded by crucifying him. And when Jesus was crucified, those there mocked him. They mocked any sense that he was a king because of the way that he was dying. But in raising Jesus from the dead, God was reversing that verdict. By raising Jesus from the dead, God was saying, the crucified Jesus is what my kingdom looks like. Not domination, but sacrificial service. Not violence imposed upon others, but radical self-giving love to the point of receiving that violence without returning it. The resurrection of Jesus declares that the cross of Jesus and the cross-shaped lives of his followers is the only way that God's kingdom comes. Think of a whistleblower in an organisation who tries to expose corruption and then they're silenced. This happens quite often. In most cases, that silencing of a whistleblower isn't just through them being got rid of, but the trashing of their reputation. It's horrendous for that person, and it's deeply stressful and sometimes very embarrassing for those who know them, particularly if they have their doubts about them. But if that person's claims are later proven to be true, then everything changes, doesn't it? Their life becomes reinterpreted. Their cause and what they stand for gains urgency. And the resurrection of Jesus is rather like that. The resurrection is God's ultimate vindication of Jesus' ministry. And this includes, firstly, the justice, mercy, and restoration at the heart of that ministry, and secondly, what Jesus said and did to show how those things come about. Loving service. So that is the first reason that resurrection inspires us as followers of Jesus to be people who seek justice through the power of love. But it goes further, because this is also true. The resurrection means that God's new creation has begun. You see, the resurrection of Jesus isn't just about life after death, it's about new creation breaking in to this present world. In John's Gospel, when Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb, it says this, and it's deliberately evoking the start of Genesis. It says, early on the first day of the week, people who knew their Bibles would go back to Genesis and the first day of creation. When it was still dark, there was darkness over creation, wasn't there? At the start of Genesis, before God said, let there be light, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw the stone had been removed from the entrance. So John's Gospel is deliberately, in the way it reports that very first Easter day, trying to get us to make the connection between the start of creation and Easter, which is the start of God's new creation. Easter Day was the first day of God's new creation. And the way that the start of John chapter 20 starts, this great chapter on the resurrection, is designed to make us make that connection. And the rest of the New Testament does it as well. We heard from Ray in that second reading from 1 Corinthians 15, Jesus being presented as the first fruits of that new creation. In other words, the resurrection of Jesus is the first installment. Really, it's the beginning of God's new world, the first fruits of this glorious harvest that will one day come in its entirety. And what this means is that the future that God promised throughout the Old Testament, in all of those glorious passages that are scattered throughout the Old Testament about the restoration that God promises to bring to a broken world, what it means is that that future has already started. It has already begun. And followers of Jesus, you and I, are called to be signs of that future in the present. So working for justice, working for things to be in accordance with God's will in this world, that's not an optional add-on for particularly keen Christians or for people particularly drawn to that agenda. It's for everyone who seeks to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And the reason why is because acts of loving justice in the present are a preview of God's coming kingdom. That all those who belong to the risen Jesus are called to be part of. Think of those trailers that are made for films. No film comes out today without a trailer being made, usually at quite significant expense for that film. And it trails it in the cinemas, doesn't it? In the months before the release of that film, you see trailers popping up for that film. We've got 4 cinema clubs now here at Christchurch, and where it's possible, Anna Larkin, who works in the church office, provides a link to the trailer for those films in the weekly mail shot email that goes out. And a good trailer for a film gives you an exciting glimpse of what's coming up within it. A really good trailer for a film excites you. It makes you want to see it, doesn't it? It shapes your expectations. And Christian acts of loving justice are meant to do the same. Feeding the poor, advocating for people who are oppressed, for people who need other people to go into bat for them. Things like reconciling enemies, whether that is on a broad scale or whether that is sort of individuals within a workplace, for instance. All of that is kingdom work, and all of it forms trailers for God's future world. Those actions don't complete the story, but they point to it. They show what's coming. And they work, crucially, to get people on board to that agenda. And that's because actions that anticipate God's future, in however small a way, they build and foster hope. See, those people who've worked with those caught up in spirals of poverty, abuse, exploitation, and hardship, what they will always say is that perhaps the biggest barrier of all to helping those people is the way that their experiences have eroded, often in a way that seems pretty permanent, their hope. And plenty of people in this world who are less impacted by those things also lack the motivation to do anything about them because they've got a similar view that nothing can really change. They've got a similar lack of hope. Whether it's people caught up in terrible sort of abuse and exploitation and harm, or whether it's other people not doing anything about it, very often the cause is the same. It's a lack of hope, a lack of belief that anything can really change. But the resurrection of Jesus Christ proclaims that it can and it will, and indeed that change has already started to happen. The resurrection of Jesus is a tangible trailer that God shows us to indicate what is on its way. And the resurrection is intended to inspire us to be living trailers for God's new world. That's what we are called to be. We are meant to be living trailers for God's new world, bringing transforming hope through our commitment to bringing acts of justice, but always through the method of costly, self-giving love, never seeking to impose justice by any other means than by loving, costly, sacrificial service, the way of the cross. And the resurrection also continues to inspire a justice agenda for Jesus' followers because it does this. The resurrection creates a sent community. When they resurrected Jesus, when the risen Jesus appeared to his followers, he didn't say to them, sit here quietly and wait for heaven. He said these words. He said, as the Father has sent me, I am sending you. He did tell them to wait long enough to receive the Holy Spirit, but that happened fairly quickly. Jesus tells them to wait in Jerusalem at the end of Luke's Gospel and at the start of Acts for what God was going to give them. And at Pentecost, 50 days after Easter, they received the Holy Spirit. They didn't have to wait that long, and the Holy Spirit has already come on all those who belong to Jesus. So there's no excuse for us waiting around. We've already received what's there to equip us for this task. The resurrection of Jesus, in other words, creates a mission-shaped community. What Jesus was for Israel, the church is called to be for the world. And let's remind us of those words that Jesus spoke in the synagogue at Nazareth from Isaiah 61. As we heard, Jesus came to proclaim good news to the poor, to set the oppressed free, to heal the brokenhearted, basically, in summary, to restore dignity to the downtrodden. And so the church, through the power of God's Spirit, which is the very reason God's Spirit is given to us, is to be the continuation of Jesus' work in the world. Now that can be pretty scary, can't it? It's one thing to say it from up here in the pulpit, but if we take it really seriously, we can gulp and think, how on earth can we be up to this? It can be scary, not to mention impossible. But that's where this point comes in. The resurrection fuels courage for justice. You see, working for justice is always costly. It never comes easily. It always has been costly. Working for justice means standing against powerful systems invested in injustice. It always means personal sacrifice. And the road towards justice for those who seek that agenda is always painful and difficult. It means constant disappointment. It means any progress that's seen is often very slow and often not even seen, largely unseen. So why persist? And where does the motivation come from for that persistence? Well, it comes from the resurrection of Jesus. Because the resurrection of Jesus tells us that evil, however things look, is not going to win. Death is not going to win. And the resurrection says to us that our labour, that our work for God is not in vain. Now, that last phrase comes from the very last line of Paul's great chapter on the resurrection, chapter 15 of his first letter to the Corinthians. Paul tells the Corinthian church to be many things in this great letter. It's very varied. And then towards the end, virtually at the end of the letter, Paul has this great chapter on the resurrection. And it's not because that's just the last subject he's got round to dealing with. It's because it underpins everything that Paul is calling the church at Corinth to be and to do. And when we look at 1 Corinthians 15, it's a great long chapter. It's all about the resurrection of Jesus and the resurrection of those who belong to him. And Paul spends 57 verses going into great detail. We had part of it read to us earlier on what the resurrection means. And then, after those 57 verses, he finishes that chapter. And we might expect him to end a chapter on the resurrection by saying something like this: "And so what a wonderful hope you've got to look forward to." But he doesn't. Instead, Paul ends this great chapter on the resurrection with these words. He says this: "Therefore," in other words, building on everything I've said, "dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you." And then this part: "Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord." Why? Because you know that your labour in the Lord is not in vain. Christians work for justice not because success is guaranteed in the short term. They work for justice because God has already secured the final victory. He did it actually through the death of Jesus, when his love came face to face with evil and stripped it of its power and defeated it. But the reality of that victory on Good Friday is revealed or shown through the resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus was what showed that that decisive victory on Good Friday had been won. It might have looked like a defeat. It was the very opposite, because God's love had come face to face with evil and stripped it of its power. The resurrection, in other words, makes a huge difference, if we believe it, to our motivation to be part of this ongoing victory of God through the death of his Son, Jesus Christ. Think of all those people who worked for years and years to end the evil of slavery. Throughout the 18th century, there were loads of people who were invested in ending the evil of slavery. At the beginning of the 19th century as well, that tends to get most of the attention, someone like William Wilberforce. But there were plenty before him who fought to end that appalling evil. And at a time when a lot of people thought that was ridiculous, it would be like people today suggesting we could go without electricity or cars or something like that. That was the attitude a lot of people took towards slavery. But there were people who nonetheless battled and battled for its abolition. And most of them never saw the results of that endeavour. So what kept them going? Well, what kept them going was a belief that justice ultimately aligns with the deepest truth of reality. And the resurrection of Jesus gives us that assurance. Love and justice are not futile. The resurrection proclaims that they've already triumphed in the death of Jesus. And one day the resurrection of Jesus proclaims the God of love and justice will be, as Paul says in that chapter for 1 Corinthians, all in all, utterly supreme. We are called, and indeed inspired by the resurrection of Jesus, to so believe in that future, to be so convinced that it's true, that we come on board to that future in the present. And finally, and crucially, the resurrection does this as well. The resurrection transforms how we see every single person. If God raised Jesus from the dead, and will in the future raise all those who belong to Jesus, it tells us something very profound about human dignity. It tells us that the body matters. It tells us that people matter. It tells us that this world matters. And if every single person in this world is someone whom God intends to redeem and restore, then things like poverty are not acceptable. Things like racism and any form of prejudice is not acceptable. The exploitation and oppression of any human being by another or by systems is not acceptable. Social justice, in other words, becomes a natural outworking of resurrection faith. If we know of a really important building that's in a state of disrepair but is going to be fully restored and made beautiful, and we believe in that happening and we're looking forward to that happening, we wouldn't trash that building further in the meantime, would we? We do everything possible to anticipate and work towards its restoration. The resurrection of Jesus proclaims that God is restoring humanity and this creation. And so people who belong to his risen Son and who are given his Holy Spirit will always work towards that agenda. So the challenge for each one of us this morning: where does the specific application of this lie for us? We think about this as a church community, but we also think about it as individuals as well. We think about it personally. To what part of this connection between the resurrection of Jesus and an agenda for justice is God particularly drawing you towards this morning? Is there a particular cause that you felt drawn to for a while that has moved you, but you haven't yet particularly thrown yourself behind? Is there an aspect of the work of this church, if you're a regular member here, that God is calling you to get further behind with the gifts, the time, and perhaps the passion and the insight that he has given you? Or perhaps, is there a person that you encounter during your day-to-day week, maybe at work, maybe a neighbour, and you've already seen that their life is full of difficulty and hardship? Is there a person out there that you've been given a particular angle on, the particular perspective, to see where they desperately need to receive help and hope? And is God possibly, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ and your belief in that, calling you personally to be the channel of that help and hope? There may be someone in your workplace or someone you know locally who's difficult and not particularly pleasant. But that is the sign that they desperately need God's love. And perhaps you are aware already that they've had it tough. They haven't had the advantages perhaps that others have had. Their life actually needs to receive God's loving justice. If one of those things or something similar might be the case, the first step for us to take is to pray. To pray that God will open our eyes to what he wants us to see, to the opportunity that he wants us to step into, to the opportunity that he's giving us to be a channel of his resurrection life, and to give us the courage to be able to respond. Belief in the resurrection of Jesus Christ isn't anything to do with escapism. It's nothing to do with escape from this world. It's a call to action within this world. The resurrection of Jesus Christ tells us that God has vindicated Jesus' way, has shown it to be right. The resurrection of Jesus shows us that God's new creation has begun. The resurrection of Jesus shows us that we are sent as its participants. The resurrection of Jesus shows us that because evil and injustice have been defeated, our work, our labour in the Lord is not in vain. And the resurrection of Jesus shows us that every single person in this world has infinite value and dignity. And all of this means that as Christians, we should pursue justice, not just out of a moral duty, but out of our belief in the resurrection of Jesus. If Jesus Christ is risen, then the world is already being made new, and we, wonderfully and excitingly, are invited, indeed we're called, to be part of its transformation. Let's turn to prayer for a few moments now.